Hi, class. So I hope you're enjoying ethics. I wanted to go over chapter 7. This is actually a pretty short chapter. We're going to be talking about the utilitarian approach. Hopefully, you're seeing some of the progression on how the author or where the author goes. You could see that he does a really good job, um, starting with social contract theory and some of the issues with ethical egoism, as well as challenges of subjectivism. And now we're hopefully what you're getting to the point is you're going from you're hopefully feeling some kind of angst on trying to find some kind of moral structure or ethical structure. And he's not necessarily in chronological order in the sense that he's following a particular timeline, but the author is talking about ethical theories that are maybe a little bit more complex than the previous ones that he's already talked about. So the utilitarian approach, as explained by the author, was developed by a guy named Jeremy Bentham. And what Bentham did, or what he said, is that ethics shouldn't necessarily involve God or creeds or doctrines. The thing that it should basically the foundation for ethics need to be pleasure, whether or not something feels pain, or how we should be living in a kind of in a way that maximizes our pleasure. Now, right there, I think it's very easy to kind of feel like is what Bentham's saying is he just basically saying that we could just live these hedonistic lives and just basically do whatever we want and say whatever we want as long as we're feeling pleasure. Well, no, not necessarily. Bentham, what he was most known for, even though the book doesn't necessarily specify this, the next chapter might for a little bit. He was known for what he would call the pleasure calculus or the happiness calculus. And what that was, most of you have probably done this before when you're planning on something, planning on, say, for example, whether or not you should move to Arizona or California or Massachusetts. What do you usually do? You usually think of the pros and then the cons. The pros being, say, for example, living in California, lots of sunshine, especially if you're near Hollywood. Maybe if you're a theater major or wanting to get into movies, you'll be around more, theater productions, not theater productions, but film productions, those types of things. You are around significant, more beautiful people. I've been there once. I was kind of surprised. All the beautiful people around me, men and women. Everybody just looks so happy. They're very, very laid back. I'm actually from the South. One of the things I really liked about Southern California is that they had the intellectual, they had the intellect of a Northerner, but they had the politeness of a Southerner. It was kind of like the best of both worlds. So I really enjoyed it. But those are the pros. The cons would be cost of living. I heard it makes Massachusetts look cheap in a lot of ways. Property taxes have gone through the roof, especially recently. And whatever your views of immigration, whether or not it's helping or hurting, I'll leave that up to you. So you get what I'm saying. You kind of write a piece of it. You just put on a piece of paper your pros and then your cons. And what do? Kind of think about it. Talk to some friends, and then maybe you'll basically choose the option that's going to give you, in that sense, the maximum pleasure. So I say that because I think the utilitarian approach, when he says that happiness is our greatest gain, what they're not saying is that you could just do whatever you want, and as if that's going to be always going to be the best option for you. Bentham, though, wasn't quite as disciplined in that as John Stuart Mill. Bentham was really the start of that, but the principle of utility is that it requires us in all circumstances to choose, that we should choose the thing that's going to produce the most happiness that we can. So John Stuart Mill makes it a little bit more complex. He takes the happiness calculus and he actually says that Bentham is kind of lacking in some of his discipline. He actually felt like it was going to lead to this kind of like hedonistic, relativistic society. And Mill talked a lot more about not necessarily the immediate happiness, but we should always be looking for the long-term happiness. And Mill was very good at kind of talking about, we should be looking for we should be choosing things that may even cause us to suffer immediately. This is Mill's argument, as long as it's going to bring us a much, much happier future. So future, that being, retirement. So what do? We usually maybe we'll invest in a 401k or an IRA or an IRA, and we stop going on as many dates as we possibly possibly want, or maybe we don't go on as many vacations, for the hope that when we become 65 or 66 or whatever, we'll have enough money in our account that we could actually live pleasurable lives. It's a perfect example of that. I just noticed that I'm wearing my CrossFit shirt. I didn't feel like wearing my little Mr. Rogers cardigan. It's right behind me, but I just decided to. Anyway, so CrossFit, I could start with that. So CrossFit would be an example. I go and I suffer. I try to do CrossFit about 5 days a week because I'm crazy. And I suffer for 45 minutes to an hour every single day so that I can breathe better, so I can move around better. I've got 3 kids. I do on-call work at the hospital. So I suffer every day for about 45 minutes for the greater gain that I'll actually live longer. So John Stuart Mill really talked about that. He talked about choosing things. Our ethical decisions should be taking the principle of utility very seriously, and the principle of utility is, in all circumstances, the one question we need to ask is, what's going to produce the most happiness? And so one thing that Bentham stated, and is one of the things that we saw this in our previous contract, the social contract theory, is that God wasn't really in the picture for Bentham or Mill. They didn't necessarily, as Peter Singer said, morality is not a system of nasty puritanical prohibitions designed to stop people from having fun. So this kind of brings back into the whole, the utilitarian approach. Utilitarianism has a little bit of ethical egoism in that sense, a little bit of Ayn Rand in the sense it's kind of libertarian. Libertarian is basically that we shouldn't, many utilitarians don't necessarily think that a big government is going to be helpful. The reason for that is because when you think of a lot of people giving prohibitions, whether it's religion, whether it's government, anything that's kind of putting itself in a place of dominance toward other people, the problem with many utilitarians is that it prevents people's ultimate happiness in a lot of those situations. And also, utilitarian has a kind of a subjective approach in the sense that the individual choice, or the individual is the sovereign, that he or she is to trust their own decisions rather than choosing somebody else. In other words, what I consider to be happy or what I consider to be pleasurable may not necessarily be pleasurable for you. Many of you probably don't want to do CrossFit, and that's fine. It would be somewhat tyrannical if I forced everybody that didn't like CrossFit to do CrossFit because I felt like that's the best thing that they could do to live better in their lives. You get what I'm saying. Many of you don't necessarily want to save for 401k. That's fine. Actually, just started mine. So I'm a little older, not too old, but I wish I would have done it in my 20s. I didn't. I decided to do it a little bit later. But it would be much like if the government just started forcing you to save for retirement, utilitarian would strongly object to that because, again, you're still kind of assuming you want to live up to your 75 or 85. I can't necessarily assume that. I may want to live a long life, but you may not want to live a long life. Maybe you want to have as much, you want to enjoy the time that you have right here in the next 20 or 30 years up until you're about 55, 60, just really live fully because you don't really know what life is what's going to come your way. And there's some argument to that. One of the saddest things that sometimes I see at the hospital, and I see it a lot actually, is that people will live, not live, but they'll work 35, 40 years for a company, working their tail off, and if this company has a pension, most pensions, the way they work is that you get 80% of your last 2 years. So what a lot of people will do when they're about 50, 59, 62, 63, whatever, is that they work excessively, about 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week. And then all of a sudden, because they want to get the 80%, they want to get 80% of their pension. And what ends up happening at 65, your body just can't necessarily do that. All of a sudden they stop, and within 2 years they're dead. And really think about that. It's really discouraging. It's really kind of discouraging because you're working, and then all of a sudden at 66, you die at 67, 68. Can't even enjoy the latter part of your life. Dementia. So one of the things I see at the hospital, was saying before, is that dementia would happen to people. I mean, somebody would come in the emergency room. They're dealing with early onset dementia at 58, maybe 64, 66. Happens. It's pretty common, and all of a sudden, just the loss of your memory. So the reason why I bring all that up is that even though you can make an argument that I should be building up toward a happiness calculus toward retirement, that's for me. That's my own opinion per se, but I can't necessarily force you to be happy in that particular way, because actually there's a pretty good argument to be made that says, you know what, I don't know what life's going to bring. I actually want to live as fully as I possibly can in my 20s, 30s, 40s. I don't necessarily want to save. Okay, I understand that. So what utilitarianism, the utilitarian approach really tries to do is protect what we would call the sovereignty of the individual. In other words, what is truly happy for you, you need to kind of figure that out. Sounds a little bit like subjectivism that we talked about earlier, but there's the one thing that the one disagreement with it is that happiness would be the meta-narrative, the one thing that we all have in common that we should all kind of fight for. So it gives some examples, and it gives some really interesting examples. If the principle of utility is true, that we should seek things that produce the most happiness that we can, then we need to ask some questions. The first question that it asks, the first example, is euthanasia. It gives an example of Sigmund Freud, the latter part of his life, the last 5 to 6 years, just after when he was diagnosed with oral cancer. He smoked cigars successively, and he got oral cancer. And during his final years, his health went up and down, but he had lost the majority. I think his whole bottom, the whole bottom of his jaw. And it was really, I mean, he couldn't speak, he couldn't really sleep very well, the rot, sorry to be so vivid here, but the rot from the muscle became so bad that none of his friends wanted to hang out with him, and even his poor dog wouldn't even want to be near him. Can you imagine that even your dog doesn't even want to go near you because you smell so bad. And so what Freud did is that he called one of his friends and he said, look, as a doctor, Max Schur, and he said, look, I told you about 20 years ago, I don't see, that if an individual has come to a place where he doesn't necessarily want to live anymore, I feel like it would be his right, and it should be his right to be euthanized. In other words, to die peacefully. And so he asked his doctor friend, Dr. Schur, he said to please give me a drug and let me die. I basically want you to perform euthanasia. And the doctor did, and he fell into a restful sleep, and that's how Freud died. And that brings up a question right here, because you have two different types of people. You have the utilitarians who'd say, yeah, that's perfectly fine. If you get to the point of your life where you don't necessarily want to live anymore, why should other people tell you that you can't live? Now, utilitarians are very careful. They're not advocating suicide. It's not necessarily what they're saying. They're not saying if like an 8-year-old kid's saying that, you should encourage him to do that. Nor are they saying if you're healthy and wise or whatnot. And most utilitarians would say, we need to help you out to see the pleasure that you already have. But what utilitarians would say in this case is that Freud really reached a point where he could just not live anymore. The pleasure calculus was so low that there was really no argument for him to necessarily move on. Therefore, utilitarian would say that's euthanasia is moral. But that goes against a lot of traditions. It goes against traditions, especially in Christianity and Judaism, that has a significant or the divine command theory that we talked about, or maybe even social contract as well, that says that if we make a contract with one another, that we can't just necessarily, once we start talking about what we deem unpleasurable, you get in some really dangerous categories. Right now, this is a very serious thing in, I believe it's Denmark. Denmark is a crisis on their hand. They have absolutely no mental. Uh, there's no one in their country, I believe, or excuse me, maybe the population is extremely low, but no one is allowed to live if they have IQ lower than 70. They actually commit euthanasia to a lot of people who have MR, mental retardation, not necessarily the political correct way, but I mean they commit a significant amount of abortions based on somebody having MR, and I take a really I have a lot of concern for that. I think probably most of you actually watching this, I'm sure you've had cousins or maybe you have family members, maybe you've had friends. One of my clients had MR. So it's the sweetest people I think you'll ever meet. At our gym, we have a lot of we actually every Wednesday night, a lot of people who are intellectually have a severe intellectual disability, they actually come to the CrossFit and they'll like work out, and they're like just these amazing people, just really sweet, amazing people. So that's in Holland and some other countries though, but in Europe, that's exactly what they're doing. They're actually committing abortions based on the person's intelligence, and when you basically put it on the on yourself to say, well, this person doesn't necessarily have the right to live because he's not living in a pleasurable way, what I deem to be pleasurable, then you run in some really dangerous categories, or you might run in some dangerous policies. But I may be committing a straw man here a little bit. And the reason why I say that is because the utilitarian, or John Stuart Mill, and possibly Bentham, I'm not sure about him. I'm not quite as aware of his writing. But I think Mill would say the government should never be in that position to be dictating happiness anyway. It should be really left up to the individual. Just trying to make the argument a little bit more complex here. So I think utilitarianism could be somewhat dangerous if it's used kind of like the Holland example and saying, we're going to kind of define happiness for ourselves, kind of like what I was saying, what we shouldn't do. But if it's used from an individual perspective, then it could be maybe helpful. So it goes back to the example with Freud. Did he have a right to die? And that does bring up a really good point. Do people in their maybe their late 80s, early 90s at the end, I'm sure some of you have seen people who are in their geriatric age, they just don't necessarily have the will to live anymore, and they really do want to go. Why do we feel like we need to keep them? It brings up an ethical question. It really does. If that's where they're at, what kind of conversations should we have? Why do we want them to keep living? Anyway, brings up some really tough questions. The other example that it has is marijuana. Now you could kind of tell it's a little outdated, because don't you know, Rachel's, that yes, mine's 2010, the 7th edition. I don't know if some of you guys have the 8th edition. I think that was 2012. Still some really good points though. Marijuana. He states, if you look at marijuana, what should we do with marijuana? You could see that marijuana doesn't really cause violence. Marijuana is not a gateway drug. It can be very pleasurable. It's not necessarily highly addictive, but the problems with marijuana is that you can have severe withdrawal from it. You actually it's not pleasant if you've been smoking it for a long time. It could cause severe respiratory problems. I think like one joint is equivalent to 7 or 8 cigarettes. And the other thing too is that it could often cause you to have significant cognitive disabilities. But that brings up the question, though, going back to the principle of utility, in the sense that we should, choose things that would produce the most kind of happiness, that we can. Who's to say that that we shouldn't allow drug use? And I would even say the legalization of drugs. Utilitarians to now would probably want all drugs to be legal. That's what's going on in Amsterdam right now. So I've really been challenged by that more and more. I mean, the amount, the book gives an example of more than 44, and this is back in 2010, 44,000 people are behind bars, at least it was 8 years ago, for marijuana use, which is really concerning. especially when you look at the amount of people who commit severe crimes like involving alcohol and beating up their wives or beating up their kids and stuff like that, and they're free. And you got some guy that smoked some weed and now he's in prison taking up the cell. Really brings up a really good point. Why are we putting them in there and not putting the actual quote criminals in the prison system? So a utilitarian, I'm going to go a little bit further. As a utilitarian, if I'm pretending I'm a utilitarian, I'm just going to pretend that I am. I would actually be arguing that if somebody wants to use opioids, it's just what utilitarians would say. They should be allowed to. It shouldn't necessarily hold other people. In fact, this is what Amsterdam does. Amsterdam, a lot of people will just come. They'll come to a clinic. They'll get their little opioid shot, for example. It's clean. The needles are clean. If they want to, and it gives them just enough where they're not going through withdrawal, but they're also functional. And then they go back to work and everything else. There's not a stigma like we have over here. And so same thing with cocaine or whatnot. It's totally legal. And believe it or not, there's not nearly as much addiction over there than it is over here. Now, that argument's somewhat problematic because we have a heck of a lot more people than we do in Amsterdam. But it brings up the point that if drugs were legal, and if we actually had a good system in place, and we actually had a good tax system in place that we would tax a lot of these drugs, and we could do it clean, we could do it in a much cleaner way, we could do it in a way that's pleasurable for the person, and yet it doesn't cause more harm toward other people, moderate a lot better and let them choose whatever they would like to choose. Why say that they can't? Now, is your professor saying that we should just allow opioid use to completely get? No, I'm not necessarily. No, I'm not saying that. But it does bring up the question as utilitarian. Well, maybe I am. Yeah, maybe I am. No, but really, it does bring up the question from a utilitarian perspective that who are we to say if someone chooses to live, whether it's through certain substances, whether it's their sexuality, whatnot, if that's how they want, that's how they view happiness, and they're not hurting anybody else, why do we feel like we have to go in there and rob that from them? And that's the key. We have to make sure that they're not hurting other people. Because a utilitarian would say, once you get to the point where you're hurting others, then that's where the law can come in. Because again, why? Because you're actually taking away pleasure from others. So going back to the substance abuse, I think this gets tricky. Is that when it gets to the point where you're stealing your mom's money and hurting other people, and this goes back to the marijuana, because marijuana makes people a lot more peaceful. Alcohol, on the other hand, can make people a lot more violent and abusive. So utilitarian might press for certain legislative rules on alcohol, but not necessarily for marijuana, mainly because it causes a lot more harm toward other people. Anyway. And finally, the third example, one thing that utilitarianism has had a very powerful influence in our culture is animal rights. Utilitarians don't really want to hear any kind of argument that says that humans are up here and animals are down here. Utilitarians would say no, that's BS. That doesn't mean anything. Yes, humans can rationalize things. They know they can have a love of art and love of literature. But for the utilitarian, the only thing that matters is, can you feel pain and can you feel pleasure? And if an animal can feel that, then we don't have the right to cause that animal, regardless of where it is on the spectrum, on how conscious it is, to cause it to have it experience a significant amount of pain. Because utilitarians would not agree that we would just administer pain to things. We want to administer pleasure. So utilitarians actually have done a significant amount of social awareness, per se. Peter Singer, I would say he's right up there with a very strong voice for animal rights. And the British psychologist, Richard Ryder, even coined the term speciesism. Unlike racism, speciesism is that the assumption that my species is somehow better than this other animal species. So utilitarians would say, look, you don't have the right to cause a significant amount of pain to animals, and if you're going to eat them per se, then we should eat things that that would be the most gentle to an animal. For example, like free range. You always look for free range meat and whatnot, because the animal got to live like a full life rather than something that's just stuck. in a cage in a slaughterhouse. So that's basically a general summary of utilitarianism. Very, very interesting philosophy. It's a little fun, a lot of ways. It's got this little tip of libertarianism, kind of do what you want, leave me alone. A little bit of subjectivism, but at the same time, we should legislate in the sense of the thing that's in the sense that if something's causing a lot of pain, we should prevent it, and we should fight for the most amount of good, the most amount of pleasure to be administered in a universal way. So I hope that helps. Go do CrossFit. It's really good for you, and I'm going to call the government if you don't. Yes. Okay. Thanks, guys.